Hello, I'm Charlie Rossiter, and welcome to Poetry Spoken Here on YouTube. We're the longest running all poetry interview podcast in existence. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. But you don't have to wait for YouTube uploads. You can also download the show from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy the show. I'm Charlie Rossiter, and this is Poetry Spoken Here. Our feature today is Karen Holmes from Atlanta. She's a much-published poet who hosts an event called the Side Door Poets in Atlanta, as well as an open mic in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In her working life, she's a freelance business writer. We're here with her because she has a book called Untying the Knot, a collection of poems about relationships and particularly divorce. That'll be followed by a review of The Poetry and Politics of Allan Ginsberg by Eliot Katz. It's the first full-length book to take a close and critical look at those aspects of Allan Ginsberg's life. I'm Charlie Rossiter, and this is Poetry Spoken Here. Today I'm talking with Karen Paul Holmes from Atlanta. She is the author of a poetry collection entitled Untying the Knot. And we're going to hear about that collection today and hear some of the poems. So, Karen, I'm so glad you could be here.
You. I'm glad to be here too.
Now, Untying the Knot is about what it seems to be about, as I understand it from the poems you sent me. So it's about you and your husband splitting. And I suppose the question that comes to me is, where in the process did you decide to go all the way to writing a book? That kind of thing inspires a poem, or maybe a few or more, but you have a whole book. How did that happen?
Well, from the moment that he told me he was in love with someone else, pretty much nothing mind. You know, when you go into a sudden traumatic situation, you're obsessed with it, and writing, I guess, is my way of coping. So I was doing a lot of writing, either actual poems or just jotting things into a notebook and turning them into poems, usually later if they seemed poem worthy. And after probably more than a year, I was talking to another poet friend who was saying, well, you know, publishers these days like a book to have a theme. And I thought, man, do I have a theme? And I looked back and I probably had 60 or 80 poems on my computer. And I started playing around with order and, you know, which ones I might keep and which ones I might throw out. And that turned into my poetry collection eventually.
Okay, wow, that's a lot, but it makes sense. It all makes sense. Yeah. So do you have one that either especially grabs you or other people really like, or that's perplexing, or whatever criterion you want?
Okay, well, I thought I'd start out with the title poem from the book. And this is one of those, you know how with a poem, some random idea pops into your head where you start thinking about something, and then it just evolves into a poem. I was walking my dogs, but the dogs' leashes were all knotted up, you know, before I put them on the dogs. And I started thinking, how do knots just form by themselves and things? And so that turned into a poem. And in researching this poem too, I also discovered a term. We've all heard the term bitter end. And what I found interesting, and maybe you know this, but I didn't, is that the bitter end is also defined as the loose end of a rope. So I thought, okay, that all works for my poem. Untying the Knot. Why do knots form by themselves? In my blow dryer cord, cell phone charger, dog leashes? What Boy Scout crept into the dark to practice right over left, around and through? And what of the sheep shank of worry in my stomach? Muscles tied tense with monkey's fists, hair tangled in little nooses, the twists and hitches in our relationship. Who caused those? Should I have jumped through one more hoop to tighten our ties, looped my love around you one more time, like a rope, Our marriage failed at the stress of the knot and frayed at the bitter end.
You made good use of that bitter end there. Yeah, I always wonder about telephone cords, the ones that are hooked to the wall. I don't understand it. You pick it up, you put it down, and it ties itself. So do relationships tie themselves? You bring up a really interesting point there. Beyond our consciousness, it just happens.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of it does anyway. We all know that, I guess. Yeah. Now, how long ago did this happen, by the way?
The first separation happened in just about exactly a year. I mean, exactly 6 years ago, because it was in March, and I remember that because it was right before my birthday. That's in April, and it was in 2010. And then the whole thing took a while, for everything to work out before the divorce actually happened.
To finish the untying. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to write the poems and to get them published and all that. So it had to be more than just wasn't last year. It's been a while.
Right.
All right. Well, how about I thought the photo of my ex was really interesting because it's the kind of thing that brings up details that make you know it's real. I hear things in poems, and you say, no, you wouldn't make that up. You just wouldn't think to make that up.
Exactly.
So it really happened. Or in novels too. I think that person had that experience and gave it to the character because it's just too real. And I think this was a great angle on it. I mean, looking at a photo of my ex on the internet. Yeah.
The good old internet doesn't hide anything these days.
Right.
Okay. Photos of my ex on the internet. Sometimes I can't resist spying on my ex's girlfriend by visiting her blog. There she is, doing yoga poses. I see her xeriscaped garden, orchids in her studio, where we used to sit and gossip. When she posted a photo of him, the caption, "My little family," coiled my gut. Could he just switch families after 30 years with me, our daughter, our dogs? But there is his hurry take the photo smile, more wrinkles than I remember in the shirt I bought. Her sad-faced, red-eyed dog, that he always disliked, sits on his lap. She stands over him, hands on both his shoulders. A few months later, I discover her family reunion. He's small in the back row of 14 people on a beach, but I recognize his posture before I blow up the photo. Wind-tossing hair, he looks happier, perhaps heavier. Jaw tucked back from the camera makes a double chin. His hands on the top of her wicker chair. There's a gap between her head, his chest. Her half-smile looks like resignation. Or maybe it's peace. Or maybe a nanosecond nothing as the shutter clicked. She wears yoga pants under her sundress, though others have on shorts, t-shirts. Probably she performed poses on the beach. Typical of her, partly spiritual, partly show-offy. I hope she's gained weight, especially in her arms, but it might be the angle. She always claimed to be estranged from her family. Have they accepted her now that she has a nice, normal boyfriend, finally divorced? It seems like I hate her, doesn't it? Let's just say I believe she's disappointed, which makes me smirk a bit. I'd like to be a knot on her wood-paneled wall to study how they get along. I peer into the photos, looking, so I can say, I told you so. But no, I'd like him to be happy, with a half pinch of regret. Here's one from Christmas. They're down wrapped on a cruise ship deck. Antarctica's white, stretching behind them. She loves penguins, and though he never could take the cold, he stands there beside her, his smile frozen.
That poem has so many, as I said, so many good details.
Thank you.
Was this? My guess would be this is not a poem that just falls out onto the page because it has so many different things. You'd have to work it a while. Did it take a while to write this one?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm a kind of a consummate editor of my poems anyway, so most of the poems went through a lot of revisions. But this one, I do specifically remember taking it to a workshop, and there's a few places in it where I recognize where people recommended I change something, and it turned out better, of course, because I got some good input on it. And anyway, so yeah, it got worked quite a bit, and all that detail, deciding what detail to put in, and when it's sort of a list poem in some ways, you have to decide what are the most important things on the list and get rid of some of the others. So,
well, I think the thing is that there aren't too many different photos, really. It's like it's a long list of 20 different, he's doing this, he's doing that, but you elaborate on each one, and again, just the little things there, and the way it goes through your moods and attitudes while looking at the photos, I personally appreciate also. It makes it seem really real.
I know when I read it in public, people do laugh in the right places.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
So, that's always good when you've got some humor in a poem. You hope people are going to laugh.
Right. Now, you mentioned workshop, and I'd ask you before we started recording, you have some very, very nice words about your book from Dorian Lux, and you say you took a workshop with her. Did you recall any special words of wisdom from her you'd like to pass on in terms of what she pushed to people about how to write poems?
Yes, I would say one thing that really sticks with me was, and this isn't just Dorian. Other poets will tell you the same thing, but I guess it was the way she emphasized it and the examples she used, or places in my poems where she showed me how this would be effective, is to end the poem on an image. So, like, for example, that poem I just read, it ends with this image of them cold on the deck of a cruise ship. And then what that does is it leaves the reader this picture in their mind that they can then sort of take that into their own imagination and see the rest of the story through their own imagination. And so it kind of gives a lingering quality to the poem. Instead, as a poet yourself, we have this sort of strong urge, I think, to wrap the poem up perfectly with a sort of ta-da ending line. And, sometimes it doesn't always wrap up so neatly like that, nor would you want it to. It's kind of neat to leave the reader with their own picture, I think. And so I really took that to heart. I went back and looked at a lot of my poems and started editing them to end on an image or a sound or something that would resonate for a reader.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. So you take out the conclusion,
Yeah.
if there is one.
Yeah.
Well, there it is. He stands there beside her, his smile frozen. They're in Antarctica. That's sweet. Yeah. Well, how about another one? This is great fun. I love hearing you read.
Okay. Well, I'll move on away from my book then.
Okay.
And I have this poem was actually appeared in the Kentucky Review last year, or almost 2 years ago, actually. And then an anthology of Georgia poets from Negative Capability Press also picked it up. And, sometimes you write a poem and you think it's just such a silly little poem, and then 2 different publishers like it. And so this is the poem.
All right.
Poem that begins with a definition. A passive sentence is often composed by a passive person. It is written with a subject acted upon by a verb, sort of like being assaulted. A phantom subject is preferred by governments, corporations, and scientists. Written complaints will be read and answered in 3 days. It has been decided you are not eligible for benefits. The solution was heated to boiling. This idea was thought up by someone anonymous. The similes were excavated one by one like a grapefruit triangle with a serrated spoon. Then edits came about through a red pencil. This poem will be appreciated by people who don't like action or responsibility. This poem will be satisfying to few because its conclusion was eaten by the dog.
Talking about editing reminded me that you do business writing in your non-poetry world, non-poetry existence. Do you find any connection there, or is it just two different things you happen to do? They're both writing.
Well, yeah, because I write a lot of advertising and website and brochures where length is really important. You got to be able to tell what you want to say in as few words as possible, especially for a headline, say in an ad or even a headline on a brochure. And so that taught me economy of words and summing things up in a crisp little package. And so I think that very much applies to poetry. One of my clients recently, they had a video that was running in a continuous loop at a client appreciation party, and it really just needed, I forget, like maybe 10 seconds or 15 seconds or something of words. And I came up with an option and sent it to her, and she said, oh, and this is a huge corporation. Everybody loved it, and it's usually so hard to please everybody. And she said, that's because Karen's a poet, So
Excellent.
I could stick, a complex idea into a few words.
Right. Well, that's a really neat way to think about it, that it requires precision.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you want the best word or the best phrase, that just zaps it right in there.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And I love editing for that too. Just how can I get rid of as many words as possible that are unnecessary in this piece, whether it's, something I've written for work or a poem. And it's kind of a fun game to see what you can get rid of without hurting anything. The meaning is still there, and you crossed out words here and there. So
yeah, that's a nice editing thought. Either kicking up the sound of a poem, I like to do that, and finding extraneous things. To excise. So what else are you going to do for me here, for us?
Well, I have another poem here that's, practically all of my poems are true stories.
You sent me that prison poem.
Yes.
Prison workshop poem.
Yeah.
I noticed that because I did a workshop in a prison once, and it's just the first time you go in is, whoa.
Yeah.
Walking through those gates and the razor wires.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as a young woman too, because this happened years ago, and it was a male prison, it was pretty intimidating and scary feeling that first time, especially. But anyway, yeah, so I find that I have to write true story. I'm not very good at making things up. I think I'd be a terrible fiction writer. I have to write about things that really happened in general. So this is a true story. The story's pretty self-explanatory in the poem, I think. So, Teaching Mozart in Stone Mountain Prison. I didn't know what crimes they committed. Didn't want to. Those 12 guys glaring at me, wondering what I had in store. No female had taught there before, so I wore a calf-length, shapeless dress, no makeup, tortoise-shell glasses instead of contacts. Twice a week, iron gates banged behind me. Paperwork shuffled. An armed guard took me down a warren of halls. He stationed himself by my door. I needn't have worried. Soon knew, just as told, if one prisoner caused trouble, he'd be jumped by the others, grateful for the chance of a college degree. This was music appreciation. None knew the classics, but one had played William Tell Overture in band. All began to embrace opera, symphony, sonata. I think the music transported them, comforted even as they struggled to study in noisy rows of bunks. One evaluation stays with me 30 years later. Thanks be to God for blessing us with Mrs. Holmes. But I felt blessed early in the semester. We arrived at Mozart Piano Concerto Number 21. Their books covered just the first movement, yet I left the record playing into the second, saying, "You've got to hear a bit of the Andante." Muted violins conjured the ethereal melody, while repeated notes in the violas mesmerized. After the pianist took up the solo for several bars, I reached out to lift the needle. 12 students, no longer thief, mugger, murderer, sang out in unison, "No, leave it on."
You know, a lovely humanizing experience. That reports, you know, they could. So you have some kind of music background. If you were teaching music appreciation, is this true?
Yes, yes. I have a master's degree in music from the University of Michigan, up in your neck of the woods.
Oh,
And haven't really used it all that much. I played the French horn in the old days, and but now I really find that I love using music references in my poetry. Some of the terminology, or references to what I'm listening to, in while I'm doing a certain activity that I'm talking about in the poem, or whatever. And so it does serve in my poems quite a certain different functions actually. And I'm glad I have that background.
yeah. So a subject matter, deep background that can float into the poems at different times.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. So do you still do any teaching of music? Or is this just
No, I
something that happened to
really
happen?
don't. Yeah, sometimes I wish I could, but you kind of choose as you go along. You have to prioritize, and music kind of became a lower priority. I mean, I always love it, and I listen to classical music in my car all the time on XM radio. But poetry's kind of taken over now as my big passion. And so if I do any teaching, it's usually poetry teaching.
And it's hard to solo on a French horn, so keeping up with that is a little more difficult than strumming your guitar or having a keyboard around the house, I suppose.
Yeah, and your lips are not made for playing a brass instrument, and so you lose your lip. If I got my horn right now out to try to play it, it would feel like I was playing on my teeth after about 2 minutes.
I hadn't even thought of that, but
if you play the piano, your fingers are like, they can be rusty, but you still use your fingers every day, in intricate ways, but you don't use your lips in the way that you do to blow on an instrument. So they lose their muscle tone, and the little ring that you see brass players have on their lip, the little scar, not scar, but a dent. Lose that. And
well, I can sort of imagine, but I'm sure every musician knows exactly what you're talking about when you say that. Yeah. Well, how about finishing us up here with another poem here? What would you like to do?
Okay. Well, if I could find this real quickly on my computer, we were just talking about French horns, and I do have a French horn poem that I really enjoy reading. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. Okay. Mastering the French horn. To master the French horn, you need lips of steel. Though lips were made for softer things than brass, you will call them chops and wear a permanent dent dead center on the uppermost. Learn to turn the horn end over end to dump the water, your spit, on the floor. You'll sit under a conductor's baton, waiting for your cue, then have to hit the right note, a slippery proposition given the tiny mouthpiece, 3 valves, and 12 feet of coiled tubing. Don't attend National Music Camp with braces on your teeth. Gain 10 pounds that summer visiting the Melody Freeze, nor date the cocky first horn player. Instead, choose maybe the cute tuba or kind trombone who will end up in the Chicago Symphony. And remember, brass players make the best kissers based on informal conservatory surveys. Most importantly, have the guts to admit it was you, 16 and too excited, who honked on the quarter rest in the final moments of Beethoven's Fifth. Otherwise, at 55, you'll still feel bad about whipping your head to look at the player on your right, implying she was the hack and not you.
That's really good. I'm glad you read that. Yeah. Glad we brought up the French horn.
Well, speaking of Dorian Lux, her husband, Joseph Millar, is also a poet, and he also taught the same workshop. So I got both of them, which was great. And he helped me in a one-on-one session edit that poem a little bit. He really liked the poem, but he had a few ideas for tweaking it. And so I always think of him when I read it.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's got a lot of humor in it. It's not there's one little funny part. It's got different little pop up, Well, this has been really wonderful. Thanks so much. We've been talking, this is Poetry Spoken Here, and we've been talking with Karen Paul Holmes and listening to poems from her book, Untying the Knot. You're listening to Poetry Spoken Here. I'm your host, Charlie Rossiter, here to talk about a thought-provoking new book about one of the 20th century's most renowned and outspoken poets. When Allen Ginsberg died in April of 1996, he was probably the most widely recognized poet in the United States, perhaps the world. He was also a cultural icon who was an important presence where issues of social justice were discussed and debated. A new book by Eliot Katz, The Poetry and Politics of Allen Ginsberg, just published by Beatdom Books, is the first major critical work to focus on the political side of Allen's poetry. One of Katz's main contentions is that Ginsberg was a poet who wrote political poems, but who was also a political activist. That is to say, Allen not only wrote poems that addressed social issues, but he was also there on the front lines at demonstrations, marches, and protests for the major social justice issues of the day. At one time or another, Ginsberg was a part of public demonstrations around issues of nonviolence, nuclear proliferation, racism, environmentalism, gay liberation, free expression, and economic injustice. Fortunately, Katz is as much concerned with Ginsberg as a poet as he is with Ginsberg as a political activist. Katz notes that it is often the case that socially conscious poetry is not as high quality as we might hope, and as a result, it has less impact. That's what happens when a poem with an important message is written in such a didactic manner that the reader is left to wonder, where's the poetry, limiting the poem's impact? I particularly appreciate Katz's specificity in articulating some of the tools and techniques Ginsberg used to heighten the poetic quality and resonance of his social observations and ideas. First, there's Ginsberg's use of clear images and observations in realistic narrative. It's the kind of thing William Carlos Williams does in his Red Wheelbarrow poem. Katz provides an example from Kaddish, in which Allan, mourning his mother's death, describes some of the fantasies and hallucinations that she had actually experienced and described to him. Only to have seen her weeping on gray tables in long wards of her universe, only to have known the weird ideas of Hitler at the door, the wires in her head, the 3 big sticks rammed down her back, the voices in the ceiling shrieking. Allan also used mythification, the technique of making the story he's telling more myth-like, sometimes by introducing characters from different eras, such as Moloch creature in the latter part of Howl, or the old leftists from the early 20th century who were mentioned by name in Kaddish. Such techniques allow for the present to be described, but to have that present be connected to a larger context, thus, to an extent, transcending time and becoming more myth-like. Katz elaborates on several other techniques in Ginsberg's toolkit, but I'll just talk about one more: personalization. Through personalization, Ginsberg is able to merge the personal and political. One might say Kaddish is as much a lament about his mother as it is a lament for her ideals. The personal and social become inseparable, and the poem becomes more than a son mourning his mother's death. It becomes a comment on occurrences in the wider social political world. As a participating activist, Allan did more than show up and march. He read poems, led chants, and sometimes even helped organizers plan demonstrations. His help with organizing has played a major role in creating what demonstrations look like today. Back in 1965, in Berkeley, California, Ginsberg met with organizers planning for an event that had been threatened by Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. Times were tense. Demonstrations were not looked on favorably by the majority of the general public. Allan's suggestion for decreasing tensions was to make the protest what he called a non-violent theatrical spectacle, so that it made a statement, but also lowered tension and anxiety for both the demonstrators and for the wider community. Specifically, he advocated that demonstrators bring along flowers and musical instruments, and even candy bars to give to the police, as well as to the Hells Angels who had threatened to beat them up. In that time, before iPhones, remember, this was 1965, Allan urged anyone who had a movie camera to bring it along in case footage was needed later for support in court cases for those who might be arrested. A quick look at the activities around the recent Occupy Wall Street movement or any recent demonstration show how many of the suggestions Allan made 50 years ago are still a part of what happens today. Eliot Katz has created an insightful and thought-provoking book about one of the most important poets of the 20th century, a poet who, because of his activism, was also an important cultural figure of his time. I should mention that The Poetry and Politics of Allen Ginsberg is an update and expansion of Katz's doctoral dissertation that he completed back in the 1990s. As such, it is very well researched. For those who want to dig deeper into Allen Ginsberg's poetry, life, and times, there are 15 pages of references to works cited by Katz in the text. I'm Charlie Rossiter, and you have been listening to Poetry Spoken Here. You've been listening to Poetry Spoken Here. I'm Charlie Rossiter, inviting you to join us again next time to let poetry speak to you. Music for today's program was written and performed by Jack Rossiter Munley. And remember, Poetry Spoken Here is more than a podcast. You can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/poetryspokenhere. Follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/poetryspokenhere. For more about today's show and other Poetry Spoken Here podcasts, as well as our blog, just visit our website, poetryspokenhere.com. If you'd like to submit suggestions of poets or topics for future podcasts, you can send to our email address, poetryspokenhere@gmail.com.